cook on the wood stove today and in the oven. I took out of the freezer some large beef bone pieces, and what I do is I roast these first in the oven, and then they will simmer on the stove top for about 24 to 36 hours. So the first step is going to roast these in the oven. This wood stove has a neat feature. It has this pedal here. So if I was carrying something over, I could do that and it would open up for me. Just put in another log. The bones are roasted. I'm using my large Dutch oven. The pot is too heavy to carry with water when it's full, so I bring jugs of water over. I save all of the ends to the onions and carrots that I use for other cooking, broccoli pieces, leave them in a bag in the freezer, and then I use them for cases like this. Just dump that in. Using fresh herbs. This is sage from my garden that I've dried as full leaves, rosemary from my indoor herb garden, and thyme from my indoor herb garden. I'm going to cover it and then it'll simmer here on the wood stove for hours. It already is boiling. I had to move it to the center. The way this Cookstove works is it's hottest over here on this side. That's right where the firebox is. And the further you get to the right is cooler. And I use the rack to put things on that I don't want to be right on the surface, just to be warm. So it is a workhorse. It's great cooking on the wood stove when it's going. Look how nice. Because the stove is going anyway. So I'm not using any propane on my standard range. And this is over here simmering all day. The next morning, all of the hard ligament type pieces have broken down. All of this adds to a very rich, beneficial broth. Simmered here for 24 hours. Just pull everything out, strain it. I pick it over, and all of the edible pieces, like the ligaments here, that's an onion piece, I will cut those up and feed them to our dog Belle. If you don't have a dog, then you'd probably just likely toss that. All those jiggly parts are things that the dog will love to eat. Once all the solids are out of the pot, then I'll just put the rest of this liquid through a strainer. I'm going to put this out on the porch, which is my winter refrigerator. Let this cool out here on the porch. So now I'm going to strain it. I use the ball jar funnel, and I put a fine sieve in top of that. I use a 4-cup measure, and I use that to pour into this to strain it. If I were to freeze into these jars, I would, which I've done many, many times, I would fill it up to here because you need room for expansion. I'm not planning on freezing these, so I am filling them up to the top. I like this rich broth for onion soup, for sauces, for gravies. I'll use it as a base for other soups, let's say a cabbage soup. I use it in stews. After this chills, this fat separates. You can remove it and you can use it to saute veggies in. Cheaper than butter, cheaper than olive oil, all natural. I don't add salt while I am simmering it. I add a touch of salt afterwards The reason why I don't salt it is because I don't know how I'm going to use it or how much I'm going to simmer it down or how concentrated it's going to be. So I don't want it to be too salty at that point. I'm just going to put lids on them, let these cool at room temperature before I refrigerate. Once this cools, these rings will seal onto there. This will last in the fridge for several weeks. The layer of fat seals any air out. Now I go through everything and I pull out the veggie pieces. Here's a piece of broccoli. And I just mush it up. And this will be for the doggie. And she'll love it. Here's a big blob. I know it looks gross, but it is a good way to use everything that you get from your farm purchases or that you raise yourself. Gelatin rich. Oh, my dog's coming over. Even the bone marrow. That is very nutritious. My pup is right here. Hello there, Belle. All right, I think that's about it. And the rest of this goes into the trash. So there you have it. Some blobby, leftover, pulled things for your pup. She'll love it. Show everybody how you love it. Give her a piece of that. All right, pick a piece. I like to give her carrots because she's yum. One more piece. One more piece. It's a nice meaty piece right here. He loves it. Here's the final result. We have all that broth and doggy pieces. Now we're going to utilize that beautiful broth I made on the wood cook stove. This is all of the broth here, and this is the fat solids at the top. We are going to use these fat solids to saute all of these onions because we're going to make onion soup with this very rich beef broth. In a heavy pot, I happen to have the enameled cast iron, which is great. But if you don't have that, just use a pot that has a nice heavy bottom because we need to saute the onions for about 20 to 30 minutes. This is 8 onions that I've sliced. So let's get this beautiful beef fat out of here to use to saute the onions. Beef fat is very stiff. I'm going to use all of it. Now, if I don't have the beef fat, I will use butter so that it has a nice, rich flavor. I'm using all of this because I have a lot of onions. Beautiful texture of the broth, which is very gelatinous, and that is the direct result of all of that cartilage and connective tissue that was on those large bones. So that's why it's nice and jiggly like that. So this is a high quality bone broth. Using the fat here in this pan or in this pot, simmer the fat down. So we're going to have the beef broth, the beef fat, onions, thyme, and you can use wine, white wine. I like to use a dry vermouth. I feel as though it gives it a nice rich flavor. It's a nice contrast to the beef flavor. And then salt. The fat has melted, so we're going to add the onions. All of the onions are being coated with the beef fat. I will add salt at this point to encourage the onions to sweat. To get this going, I like to put the lid on and encourage that moisture to come out to sweat the onions with the salt. If you want to do the French onion or the melted cheese on top. You can do bread slices or croutons. I'm using a sourdough, which is a little bit dried out, which is perfect. Cutting thick slices, 2 of them. And we will make croutons for the cheese to rest on top. And these are great for any type of soup that you have. A flavorful crouton, either sauteed in butter or olive oil with herbs, is a nice topping. So I'm going to make these into croutons, and I'm going to use butter. It's been a few minutes. Notice the browning around the edges. It does make for a kind of a messy pot, but this is what we're looking for, these browned onions. Going to add the thyme. Fresh thyme adds a very nice flavor. I'm going to use unsalted butter for the croutons. I use Kerrygold unsalted, buy it in the bricks, and I like to keep them into this container. A little bit of multitasking. Put the bread cubes in. Onions are almost done. Start tossing the croutons. Add salt. You can add garlic, pepper, but since I'm using it in the onion soup, I just want to keep them simple, so I'm just going to use salt. And as these saute, they will brown up and become crispy. Now it's time to add the vermouth. So you turn it up to high, because we're going to add the vermouth and we want the alcohol to burn off. Notice the beautiful brown color. That's what you're looking for. You don't want too many crispy bits like those darker brown ones because they get hard. You want to have some onion to bite into in the soup. Okay, now it's time for the vermouth. I put about 1/4 cup. And I'm stirring it to loosen up any onion bits that are stuck. You might not get all of them, but it's the goal. Now we're going to add the broth. Mix this all together to combine. We will salt to taste. Once this simmers, I like it to simmer for at least 30 minutes, if not longer. Put this on the back burner to simmer after I get it to come to a boil. Croutons are getting a little bit of golden brown on them. Once the broth comes to a boil, into a back burner for a simmer. The croutons look nice. I didn't want them too hard. Want them crunchy but still soft, if you can see. I'm going to prep the cheese for the top. I'm using raw milk Gruyere cheese from Switzerland. I was able to get this at Trader Joe's. The price, $14.99 a pound, so this piece was $8.50. So it's a bit decadent. You could use other cheese. Munster cheese I have used, works well. The broiler is on. It's time to assemble the soup. I put bowls onto a little baking sheet. Now this, I'm just making it for my husband and myself, having it for lunch, so I'm having it in these bowls. If you were going to serve for an appetizer for a dinner party, these bowls are very nice for that. Fits about 1 cup of soup in there, and it makes for a lovely presentation. The croutons are easier than the pieces of bread, easier to spoon up. while you're eating the soup. And put in as much as you like. I find that's a good amount. We don't want it too far over the bowl. I slice the cheese. I'm putting on about 4 slices each. You can certainly put more on if you want it to drip down the bowl. These are going to go into the broiler until this cheese melts. That was just a couple minutes in the broiler. We do like fresh pepper on top. This is a beautiful and delicious soup that it takes some time, but it's not complicated. I just wanted to show you that using the crouton sizes is nice to be able to spoon that out. I like to put this on a plate because these are hot out of the oven. In a plate, easy to carry to the table. And whether it's an appetizer or a meal, it is ready to be enjoyed. Now we're going to make beef stew using the same beef broth. I've already sliced onions and carrots and pulled dried sage, and this is from my garden, and I dried it in large leaf format, so it's easy to pull out of the stew at the end. I took beef, I cut it into smaller bite-sized pieces, and I put in a little bit of flour just so that it's dry and it will act as a thickening agent. We're going to use the fat from the broth to saute the onions, the beef, and the carrots. We're going to cook this on the stovetop and then in the oven. Let's turn the oven on to preheat at 250 degrees. This will cook in the oven for several hours. Those are the fat chunks. Add in the beef. Saute till it's browned. Once the beef is browned, I take it out. Add in the veggies. Saute. Salt and pepper. All of those brown pieces that are stuck to the bottom will release when we pour in the broth. Don't be worried if the bottom gets very crusty. Having a heavy bottom pot is very helpful for this because it does get really hot. I'm going to add the sage now. Next we add, okay, I'm going to turn it up so that it's high. Add in the beautiful gelatinous broth, a little bit of it. Stir it to deglaze. You could use wine, vermouth. If you're going to use wine, you could use red or white for this. Just go around and loosen up the bits. It's okay if they don't all come up now. They will loosen as it cooks for a few hours. I don't salt to taste yet until I am getting closer to serving. Put the beef in. I recommend not putting in too much broth. We want it to be thick and not soupy. We can talk about thickening later, but for right now, this is what I'm going to keep here as far as the fluids. The meat is just submerged. Cover, go in the 250 oven for a few hours. The stew is done, It was in the oven for several hours today. I put it on the stovetop because we're going to do the final thickening. I wanted to pull out the larger sage leaves. The sage flavor is in there. I like to remove the leaves. I've already done a taste test, and it needs a little something, and that's common. I like to use a little bit of balsamic vinegar in there. It's that acid sweet combination. It pairs well with the carrots that are in here. So I'm going to add that first. About a tablespoon. I'm going to add one more. Touch of salt. Now I'm going to thicken it a little bit. I like to use arrowroot. So this is a tablespoon of arrowroot with a little bit of water. Give it a minute to thicken. The stew is thickened. Not too thick, not too thin. Do it to what you like. I did smashed potatoes with the skin on, and I did that for more rustic texture. Stirring in the last of the butter. And there you have it, a beautiful, flavorful beef stew with mashed potatoes with homemade beef broth. Learn how to make the sourdough in another one of my videos. Thanks for watching, and check out my In the Kitchen playlist where there's always something happening in the kitchen.